I built hardware, both electronic and other physical things, and designed circuits and a low-level code to process images. So you guys might be familiar, but infrared astronomy is kind of where all the interesting shit happens. Why is that? Right? So the farthest and oldest objects are shifted deep into the infrared. So you need to be able to look into the infrared to figure out how the universe got created, where it's going, blah, blah, blah. So that's quite a challenge to look into the deep infrared, because deep infrared is heat, right? Warmth. And so your sensors, your imaging array has to be cooled. Otherwise, it'd be like staring into a white, bright light, right? Trying to see something. And we're talking cold, right? We're talking more than liquid helium cold. And so the sensing array was mounted onto a dewar with liquid helium in it, surrounded by a vacuum, surrounded by another dewar with liquid nitrogen, so that the liquid helium was radiating to something still pretty cold. Now, that gets you down to liquid helium temps, which is around 4 degrees Kelvin. That's still not cold enough. And so, so how do you get colder than that?
I don't know. Clue? Put it in the freezer?
You pull a vacuum over it. Because now, what are you doing? What's happening, right? It's boiling at its surface, right? Where at the surface, those are all the hottest and therefore most energetic molecules of helium. And so they're boiling off. And so if you pull them off, if you suck them away with vacuum, what's left is colder. And we were able to get our sensing array down to a few tenths of a degree Kelvin.
Wow. That is, I don't think in Kelvin because that's too scientific for me. How much is that in like Celsius, Fahrenheit?
Well, that would be like minus 272.8.
Yeah, that's pretty
just
cold.
above. It's just above absolute zero.
Yeah,
just above, right? I mean, the molecules are barely moving, right? And so, and the arrays that we use were gallium arsenide arrays, which have a very small band gap. I learned how to specify all those things and design these sensing arrays, because if you use just an array in a camera, would have a very larger band gap to be sensitive to visible wavelengths. But we're looking for infrared, and so you want a much shorter get band gap that is much lower energy. So that's how you image in the deep infrared. So that's,
wow.
So I worked with astronomers and, kept the equipment, designed the equipment, and they would make observations and write papers and all that good stuff. So here we go into stories. One of the most fun projects that I did there was, so you have to remember, I was at NASA from like 78 to 85. And so that was the early days of the Space Shuttle. In fact, I was there when the first OFTs, the orbital flight tests of the shuttle, were done. And one of the big questions that they had was just how hot is the tiles on the bottom getting? Now, you can't just stick a thermostat down there, right, and say, well, how hot is that, right? Because basically it would just vaporize away. So it had to be done with imaging. Turns out NASA has, or had at that time, something called the Kuiper Flying Observatory, which was a C-141 Air Force cargo plane with a 1-meter telescope mounted to it. And so we had a project called Infrared Imaging of the Shuttle. So what we did was we mounted an infrared sensing array at the focal plane of this 1-meter telescope. And then my role was to design and build a tracking telescope, one with a very wide field of view that would acquire the shuttle and then drive the servos to make sure that the shuttle flew through the very narrow focal plane of the main telescope.
Interesting. So you kind of use that like larger one to see where it is in the sky and then focus the smaller one on that exact...
The tracker was small, but had a very wide field of view. And the main telescope had a very large mirror, but a very, narrow field of view because it's high magnification, right? Because we're looking, 30 miles out. So basically the tracker telescope would acquire the shuttle and then drive the servos to move the main telescope so that the shuttle would fly through it. Now, so was only... Go ahead.
So it's like basically for how I'm envisioning it, it's taking a really, really wide, low quality panoramic and kind of seeing what you should aim at. So that way you don't have to waste the high quality camera. And then and then once you find what you want to aim at, then aiming the high quality camera right at that, and you get the super good picture, right?
Right. Yes. Now, the fun part was how do we test this? You only have 5 orbital flight tests, right? If you flub it, you're a lot of people are going to be unhappy. And so what we did was we talked the Air Force into having the SR-71 fly shuttle reentry profiles. And so we staged the C-141 out in Hawaii and took off from there. And the SR-71 Blackbird would fly, and we would fly under it and capture it and image it. And then once we had that all working, then we were ready to capture the shuttle images, which worked really well. So that was one of the more fun projects that I worked on.
That is quite a project. I'm quite curious to hear what exactly was your contribution like to that.
I designed the tracker telescope and built it.
I see. And designed and built.
Yes.
Wow.
So, my career is a meld of hardware and firmware and software. Do it all. I mean, basically all the bits of engineering.
That is incredible. Not many people can say that. I'll tell you that. And with NASA, I mean, you mentioned this briefly, that if you flab, if you make a mistake, a lot of people will be unhappy. In the worst case, lives will be endangered, right?
Will die. Yeah. I mean, that wouldn't be the case here, right?
Yeah. But still, it's really, really incredible. How would you work with that in mind? I work in a pretty safe industry, right? I write code and, it's not mission critical. It doesn't affect human lives. I mean, maybe it affects human lives, but not to a degree to which,
Yeah. So, when you're working on that kind of stuff, I mean, number one, your hardware becomes, needs to become flight qualified. So what does that mean, right? I mean, so, first off, your designs, have to be peer reviewed, right? And then you build it and then you test it, right? Physically test it. So, for example, the circuit board, the computer that, I built had to go through both physically testing. So, for example, it's on a shaker table, right, which would apply all kinds of, vibration and stuff to it. It would go through heat and cold cycles. It would go through all kinds of physical things to make sure that, we use the most robust flight hardware, you could have. So, nothing is just, off the shelf with NASA, right? It's, you design it, lots of people look at your design, refine it, fix it, etc. So it's perfect. I mean, think about the Voyagers, right? I mean, here they are working, whatever the hell it is, 50 years later after their launch, billions and billions of miles away, and they're still working because somebody did a really good job designing hardware that would survive, the radiation and gamma rays and everything else in deep space. So that's what it's like to build stuff at NASA.